as we were like discussing the problem and staying connected to the folks we had met in India and seeing the challenge of this, I realized after that trip, human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise on the planet. There's more people in slavery in the world today than any other time in history, even at the peak of the legal transatlantic slave trade.
Welcome to More Than Profit, the podcast where values, vision, and capital converge. Produced by Axis Ventures, this show spotlights the leaders and innovators redefining success, not just through financial returns, but by the impact they create. Every episode dives into the inspiring stories, bold ideas, and hard-won lessons of those who are leveraging capital, financial, intellectual, and social, for equity, sustainability, and systematic change. Whether you're an investor, entrepreneur, or purpose-driven professional, we are here to challenge the status quo, push the boundaries of traditional investing, and inspire you to align your resources with your values. Join us as we explore how capital can be a force for meaningful change.
Today's episode is a powerful conversation with my longtime friend, Jeremy Vallerand, co-founder and CEO of a global network committed to fighting human trafficking and modern-day slavery. Jeremy's journey is anything but linear. After earning a business degree and working in both the tech and nonprofit sectors, he found himself at the intersection of entrepreneurial strategy and global justice. Growing up in a home marked by radical hospitality and a life-altering trip to India set him on a course to co-found Atlas Free, an organization now partnering with over 100 frontline initiatives across 26 countries. In this episode, Jeremy shares not only the why behind his work, but also the how Atlas Free identifies and empowers grassroots organizations, why building networks is more impactful than going solo, and how systems-level thinking is crucial to turning off the spigot of exploitation. Whether you care about justice, community-driven impact, or how philanthropy needs to evolve, this one's for you. Well, Jeremy, thanks for being here today. I was curious, first off, you and I have known each other for a while, and it's been a pleasure to see you work over the last, 8 or 9 years. You and I have known each other, so it's pretty cool. Can you give us a little bit about your personal journey and kind of how that has kind of almost bled into the work that you're doing now? Because you have a really interesting background. We were just talking about your time at Oxford and some of the things you've done historically, but help our listeners get a little bit of a backstory on you and kind of how that's led to kind of co-founding and leading this amazing global institution fighting human trafficking.
So I grew up here in the Seattle area, calling you from the rainy Seattle today. It is stereotypical weather outside. But yeah, I grew up here in a family that kind of an entrepreneurial family. My dad started a business, but I think even before that, there was this really profound turning point. Like my parents came to faith when I was a kid, and it was a pretty dramatic shift for our family. And my dad had sort of this, or both my parents had this very sort of simple understanding of faith of like, oh, well, Jesus talks about caring for the vulnerable, the oppressed, the marginalized. Like, I guess if we're following him, like they just had this very literal, like, so they opened our home to refugees. And it was this sort of messy, complex, but like really beautiful. I mean, I remember when a family of 5, I was young, my parents had 3 kids. We had 1 extra room and this family of 5 refugees moved in. And it was utter chaos, but also just really beautiful. And so that was always just a part of the DNA of our family. And as my dad's business grew, there was very much this sense of like, well, all of this is God's, and so we're supposed to use that to impact the world. And if he gives us success or resources, we're supposed to leverage that to impact the world around us. And so I kind of thought I'd go that route. I just assumed that would mean like follow in his footsteps from a business standpoint, but then use the resources we have to engage the world. And so it was sort of looking like, what's my cause? What's the outlet of, if I have meaningful success, what will the outlet of that be? And that's kind of when I encountered human trafficking on a trip to India in 2008. So a little while ago now, I met this Indian man that was rescuing kids out of brothels, and it kind of turned my world upside down. It was not an issue I really understood in 2008. Not a lot of people were talking about it back then. And I thought, okay, this will be my passion project. Like this will be when I have success or when I have resources, like I'll put them towards this. And little did I know that would end up leading to me kind of going all in on the issue.
So I have to believe, okay, so you're young, your parents are making this decision that really impacts you. Did you just never question? I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like, did you go into it and you thought it was cool? Or was there ever a moment when you were growing up, like, why in the world are we doing this? Like, did you ever feel any of those feelings of, I don't know, animosity, discomfort, like questioning, like, hey, this is our home. I need private space. I'm a
Yeah.
teenager or whatever. Like, was that, or were you ever like just all in? Like, it was just like, this is what we do as a family.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it started young enough that I didn't have the contrast. I didn't know what I was losing having the chaos in a sense, like,
Yeah.
because it just was sort of part of the DNA. I think when I was a teenager, it kind of started to like settle out as I got older and my parents were busier and we were like there was a point where there was less of that happening in the house. And then we all started realizing like, wait a second, like that was chaos. Like, why did we eat so much cabbage soup? Like that, and realizing like, oh, this family that was living with us that made like, perushkis and cabbage soup, like they were trying to contribute. But in my childhood, I thought it was normal that my house smelled like cabbage soup or whatever. And so yes and no, like more in hindsight as we looked back, and I have two sisters, and we look back being like, that was crazy. And in some ways, even like, man, we had people move in when I had young sisters at home that we didn't know, and like so much potential for things to go wrong there. And yet miraculously, in some ways, they didn't. And I think for even my sisters, they would describe it now as, yeah, a little messy, a little chaotic, but as a mostly positive, formative part of our lives.
Yeah. That's really cool. I mean, so it seems like your parents and this experience, growing up where just the chaos of life, very formative. And then there's this India moment where you are confronted with the worst of humanity in a sense, enacted on other people. Were there other moments, because again, you've kind of had an interesting path, even just leading you to co-founding Atlas Free, other moments where you can kind of point back like, man, this person or this experience was super transformative of how I think about the world or how I want to manifest my values and pursuits on the world? Like, were there some other key moments for you?
Yeah, absolutely. One of them was when I was a junior in college, I got a chance to go to Washington, D.C. for an event called the National Prayer Breakfast, which is an event that has been happening every year since Dwight Eisenhower was president.
Wow.
So every president since Eisenhower has been a part of this thing every year. And it's this, kind of moment when leaders from both sides of the aisle, and again, every president since Eisenhower has participated, where they sort of pause to sort of say, let's put our politics aside and pray for the nation and the world. And over time, it's grown. And now it's like 3,000 people come from all over the world for this sort of moment to pause and pray. And I got to attend, and I met one of the men who was organizing it at the time through mutual friends. They're like, hey, you got to sit down with this guy. And I was 23 and he was 63. And through sort of that connection, he asked if I'd come and spend a year working with him in DC. And so I ended up doing that. And that relationship, he's actually the one that took me to India 5 years after that.
Wow.
But one of the things that I saw in him that he sort of challenged me with, because, it's that stage of I finished, my business degree and went straight to DC, worked with him. So you're at that stage coming out of college where you're like, what am I going to do with my life? What does calling mean? What's my purpose? Asking those big questions that no like 22, 23-year-olds like really ready to solve. And like the reality is probably your first job's not your future career, and it's not going to like be the perfect embodiment of your calling and your purpose. And so I went and I was, asking this man who was like mentoring leaders in DC and was sort of this chaplain to leaders and was, leading these Bible studies for world leaders and ambassadors and generals. And I was like, this is unbelievable. This guy's got so much wisdom. So I'm like, what am I supposed to do with my life? And I remember one of the things he said that's really been a turning point sort of principle for me is he said something to the effect of, Jeremy, in life, you'll find it's often more about who you're with than what you're doing. And that concept, one, was counter to even sort of the faith context I grew up in, when it was like often talked about of like, oh, God's going to give you this calling and you go and you just pursue him. And you almost have this picture of people that examples of that is, oh, someone was called to move to this country and they go alone. And so to sort of have this permission to orient my life around community. And then you read in scripture, like you see in the Bible how often that plays out from a faith context of like the importance and power of relationship. And certainly like anybody who is married would say that like it's more about who you're married to than being married. And it's like it often plays out in a career as well. As like most people, the reason they stay at an organization is more about the people they're with, the team that they're on, rather than just what they're doing. But I think marriage is the best example. If somebody was like, you know what, I'm just going to be married. It doesn't matter who I'm married to. Most of us would be like, that's a terrible idea. Like if you want to be with the right person, who you're with is much more important than the concept itself.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, I mean, even having the courage to sort of jump in and launch Atlas Free, and it was much more about who I was with. And it doesn't mean what you're doing doesn't matter. Of course that matters. That's incredibly significant. But I've just seen that concept to be true, that who you're with is often even more important than what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you kind of mentioned it, but like founding Atlas Free, I mean, we were kind of invited into some conversations, and what kind of birthed from that was, Rescue Freedom, and then it's now Atlas Free. Can you give, for people that aren't familiar with Atlas Free, like what is it? And then what do you feel like is the unique kind of differentiator as you guys are thinking through attacking this problem, this massive global problem? Like what is it that Atlas Free is doing that's unique and different for that?
Yeah. The uniqueness, I'll kind of tell a little bit of the sort of that catalyzing moment because it sort of paints the picture of the uniqueness. But this same sort of mentor of mine that had taken me to India, as we were like discussing the problem and staying connected to the folks we had met in India and seeing the challenge of this, realized after that trip, human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise on the planet. There's more people in slavery in the world today than any other time in history, even at the peak of the legal transatlantic slave trade. And so was seeing this vast problem. And at the time, I had some American friends that had moved overseas to kind of go fight human trafficking. And there were some great U.S. organizations that was their primary model. It's like, let's recruit some Americans. They can move sort of to the ends of the earth to go fight human trafficking, but they'll probably have to learn the language and, learn the culture. And so that can work. And there's great people that do that. It's just not super scalable.
Right.
You talk about the fastest growing, criminal enterprise on the planet. Most people would say intuitively, yeah, like if it's just trying to get Americans to go do it, like
it's not
going to work in every context. And what we were seeing at the time was just like in India, the man that we had met that was doing this incredible work had been doing it for, well over a decade, was giving his life like all over the world. There were already people in their community that know the language, know the culture. It's their community. They have an incredible sense of ownership, and they're like literally risking their life, often leveraging like everything they have, mortgaging their house, like to serve this population. And so at the time, as we were looking at it, there was a group of us that gathered in DC, and we were kind of sharing ideas like, how do we help accelerate this problem? And again, I was just thinking through the lens of like, I'm on the business track, but like, this is where I'll use some of my passion and energy and resource. So I'm just in the room thinking I'm a contributing voice from a like strategic lens, and sort of mapped out the challenges I was seeing it of like, well, this is what we're seeing. And here, this challenge of like, it seems like we should go find the group that is scouring the globe to find like the most promising initiatives and, almost bringing a venture mindset to like, let's find what's already working that's isolated and alone. And let's partner with the local groups on the ground that nobody has access to. They don't have nonprofits in the US. There's no mechanism to donate to them, but they're also under-resourced, they're underfunded, they're undertrained. So let's find the entity that's like a global accelerator, finding organizations and coming alongside of them and investing in capacity and bringing funding, but also bringing training and tools and community. And the sort of the conclusion after that was that doesn't exist. And so I'll never forget, a couple of them called and said, hey, Jeremy, that thing that you talked about trying to find, it doesn't exist and we want to help you build it. And I was like, no, this is the worst time for me to launch a nonprofit. Like my wife's pregnant with our first kid. We just, bought some property to build a house, both working in the tech world. Like this is not a time to launch a nonprofit. But over a few months and conversations with my wife and with this sort of initial core team, and again, that kind of illustrates the principle of like, often it's who you're with, not just what you're doing. It was really this group of people that gave me as like a 29-year-old the courage to say, okay, if we're going to do this together, like I believe in the mission. I believe in this strategy and the uniqueness of what this can do in the world, and that it adds something to the fight in this world of sort of maybe larger organizations trying to export their model. Like, who's going to sort of fan the flame of what's already working? And so that's the distinctive of Atlas Free, is this network kind of approach to scouring the globe, working with over 100 organizations in 26 countries, and really trying to increase the capacity of those on the ground giving their lives to do the work. And then sort of the next level of that is then also aligning those organizations together around a shared sort of collective strategy, so that it's not just one organization and community that's trying to rescue children, but at the same time, traffickers are unaccountable and can just go traffic the next kid. It's like, how do we align organizations around a strategic framework so that there's kids getting rescued, but there's also traffickers being held accountable, and then there's also policies being passed so that the laws are in place to prevent the next generation from being exploited, and so on.
Yeah. What I really enjoy is the conversation around, you mentioned like, it's like venture capital, but there is this like new emerging venture philanthropy.
Yeah.
How do we find and fund these interventions that are actually working? Because you mentioned capacity building. It's a major problem, right? You just can't, a lot of times people with bleeding hearts that have capital, they turn around and like, okay, who do I write the check to? But that nonprofit on the ground, I mean, there's what we would call like a capital absorption issue. Like they don't know, they don't have the capacity. Yes, they could figure out probably over the next 10 years how to deploy $10 million. But there's a capital absorption issue. And so, if you think about from a domestic US context, like we have these things called CDFIs, or community development finance institutions, so that like all of these large asset holders can then deploy into local communities, because it's hard to fund its small dollar kind of boots on the ground work. And so you need that kind of infrastructure from an intermediary. So it seems like Atlas Free kind of plays that role of like, hey, we're here to help coach, train, identify, support, scale some of these local, innovative kind of approaches that have kind of cultural context, lived experience, kind of personal relationships. And then we can then help resource them both financially and with kind of social skills. I love that approach because it's much needed in more areas than just human trafficking, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and that's we often see like one of the phrases that we say internally, so many of the most heroic work of like those people that are willing to, again, like quite literally risk their lives, risk everything. And you see these, sort of Mother Teresa type figures and leaders. But we often will say that like those types of people typically don't launch organizations because they're passionate about boards, budgets, and bylaws. Like those things that like you've seen how with a nonprofit, like if you don't put some of the structural things in place over time, it's certainly not going to outlive the founder. Like if none of those pieces are there and it's just on the founder's sort of raw commitment and passion, but then helping sort of create an ecosystem where they can learn from other models. Like one of my favorite things to hear from an organization is when they've kind of joined the Atlas Free network and they're part of that community and ecosystem and getting some of those resources and funding. But one of the most common things we hear is when they just look at us and say, it feels so good not to be alone anymore. And a lot of them feeling like they're all alone. They're tackling, and human trafficking is a man-made issue that's perpetrated by cartels, criminals, like sinister actors. So they're going after very active opposition, more so than many other humanitarian issues, right? There's no cartel that's trying to promote malaria in the world. They're attacking a very coordinated, evil opposition, and often alone. And then all of a sudden they're part of a community of people that are like, oh, you're doing this? Well, why don't you come and visit us for 2 weeks? And Atlas Free is going to bring you to our program and you can learn from us for 2 weeks. And then we'll give you all of our playbook,
right?
We'll share all the things we've done wrong and what we've learned. And all of a sudden you see these programs in different countries, sometimes on different continents, getting slingshot, leapfrogged ahead by their peers, and they're not alone and they know who to call. And it's a really beautiful, sort of generous community of people that are helping each other. It's not just about us helping them. It's about building the community of people who can help each other as well.
Well, the other thing I really appreciate about that is the realization that we're not independent, we're not dependent, we're interdependent. And this idea of collective impact. And because there's two faults oftentimes.
I'm going to quote you on that one.
Okay. But it is, there's this interdependence where we can't do these things alone. We shouldn't. There's two lies, really. One lie is one of scarcity. And I think when you kind of bring this kind of full thing together, this lie of scarcity versus abundance, how do we help nonprofits and local leaders embrace a mindset of abundance? where there's enough resources and time and energy out there. We just need to kind of, because again, if we operate from scarcity, we get kind of territorial, closed off. And what you're trying to do is counter that and say, no, like actually, if we open up and we say, hey, my piece of the pie is this, and from a collective impact kind of interdependent framework, we're solving this and we're going to attack it. And we need you on our right and our left doing these other things, but we're going to really laser focus in on this. A guy I just was talking to recently said we need more laser pointers versus flashlights. We need kind of those really narrow apertures. And what we need to do is then identify how do we work together. Because the other lie from a kind of a human tendency is, what's the one organization that's going to do it all? And I actually think, in my experience, that's one, it's a fallacy. Two, what happens is you get a mile wide and an inch deep, because all of a sudden you expect this one organization to service all of these different needs. And it's just not possible. You just don't have, you don't have it.
Well, and that's, I think, what we're seeing broader in sort of the philanthropic space, kind of to that point, is these networks emerging. Our hope, and we're seeing this sort of similar, like an Atlas Free in different sectors, that's saying, hey, no one organization can do everything, but a network of organizations can. And if we can be more interconnected, and this idea, like sometimes I think of this image, this metaphor of Handel's Messiah as a symphony, right? Like one of the most famous symphonies of all time. And it's like, if you had all of these musicians that were all learning the music, they were all really good at what they did, but they've never been in the same room as others and never been invited to play it together. And so the problem is not necessarily that you need to go and tell them like, hey, you need to do this, you need to do, it's like, it's happening out there. You just need to create the space, like invite them in. Somebody's got to book the venue and hire the conductor to like actually say, okay, you guys know the music. You all are amazing at your instruments, but we're going to do it together and we're going to do the countdown and somebody's going to keep the time and the tempo, because you might have learned it in a little bit of different tempo, but it's not about the conductor. It doesn't deprive the organization of their like independence and creativity and skill, kind of finding those spaces to bring the musicians together and let them be good at what they're good at.
Yeah.
But in that context, to sort of play the symphony.
Yeah.
What does it take to turn an idea into a thriving business? For many entrepreneurs, the hardest hurdle is securing their first dollar of funding, a crucial milestone that can make or break a venture. That's where Access Ventures' groundbreaking First Dollar program comes in. Over the past 4 years, this program has been more than just a funding initiative. It's been a catalyst for change. By providing entrepreneurs with the capital they need to get started, it's enabled dozens of startups to cross the critical threshold from concept to execution. Now, Access Ventures is sharing the lessons learned in an in-depth case study that examines the program's impact and highlights the strategies that worked and challenges that remain. If you're an entrepreneur, investor, or changemaker interested in how target funding can drive economic growth and equity, this is a must-read. Explore the real-world successes, hear the stories of founders who've benefited, and discover insights that could transform the way we think about the early-stage funding. Visit accessventures.org to dive into the First Dollar case study and see how Access Ventures is reshaping what it means to empower entrepreneurs. Don't miss this chance to learn from projects that's redefining access to capital. Check it out today.
So, Jeremy, how do you balance? Because I do think there's this tendency oftentimes, like it's from a medical context, right? I was in the military. So it's like there's this sucking chest wound that just has to be covered. So it's just bleeding out and we got to put a Band-Aid on it. And so that's that kind of that relief work. Like we got to get these folks out of their circumstance. But then there's the other work around development and reform. So relief, development, reform. How do you balance kind of the intervention side of the work and then the systemic kind of change side, policy, but also market structures and how we think about the dynamics that actually push people into trafficking and slavery? Like, how do you balance that work and how do you think about that as Atlas Free looks to the future?
Yeah, I think part of that, it's funny you bring it up because just in this last week, I was talking with the leaders of a program that are doing sort of residential care. So it's that incredibly hands-on, like you're walking with somebody that's come out of trafficking and it's super comprehensive, right? Dealing with all of the trauma, many of them have criminal records because they were forced to commit crimes while so they're talking about that. And I'm talking about some of the things that we're thinking about at Atlas Free from like a large scale policy and sort of the systems level. And their sort of reaction was like, first, they were looking at me and they're like, we don't have time to think about the system stuff. Like, we are so immersed in the day-to-day trauma of like helping these survivors have the next thing meeting their next need. And for them to sort of say, we're so glad we're part of a community that you can think about that. And my reaction to them was like, the only reason that we can think at the systems level is because we're not doing what you're doing in the weeds every day. Like, I don't wake up in the morning with, a list of the emergent needs of like the next sort of triage, the survivor doing that day-to-day counseling. Like, I think it's really hard to do both.
100%.
And so I think it's, again, building that ecosystem where you can find the systems thinker, because it's a different type of, again, the person that wants to get up thinking about the systems level. What are the policy pieces? What data is missing? What studies need to be funded? The systems level thinking is different than that person that raises their hand to say, like, I'll risk my life. I'll give everything to, like, I'll be available 24/7 to do counseling and therapy and sit with those survivors. And so we've tried to stay really disciplined over the years. We've had a number of sort of requests from organizations maybe that were struggling that said like, hey, would Atlas Free run our safe house? You guys have trauma therapy trainings, you have these tools. Why don't you just run our safe house? And we've been really disciplined about saying, no, that's not our core competency. Like, we're trying to align this network around more of a systems thinking, strategic thinking. So I think it's kind of to your earlier point of like, one organization can't do everything. I'm really skeptical when I hear an organization saying, oh, we run a safe house, we do trauma therapy, we walk day in and day out with survivors. Oh, and we're also this like systems thinking, we're leading all the policy, we're operating over here, because it's a different skill set and it's hard to operate in both.
I think unfortunately though, sometimes organizations get pushed into that by funders. Because there's an expectation from funders because they like an organization and they're like, hey, could you do this? And so there's this pressure from an organization like, oh, I guess we should be doing that because our funder wants it. They get that kind of that mission creep where it's like, really, they're really good at trauma care, or they're really good at that kind of interdiction kind of, let's get them out and into a better place. But they're not great at the policy. They don't have the team and the capacity to do it, but that's what they're being asked of from their funders. There's this other side.
That is true, I think. Also, where the organizations that are really systems minded, the thing that often donors want to fund is like the story of like, but are you running a safe house? Because that's really easy to get my head around. And so sometimes the systems thinkers get pushed into trying to run a program because the donors actually often don't want to fund the systems things that can sound impersonal and one step removed. They want to fund the story.
Correct.
And so it goes both directions.
100%. And part of it too is like, and I think we need to call it out. Like we need to kind of in some ways indict and kind of look at how funders are operating. And so what I've experienced with a lot of nonprofits over the years is there's kind of this 3, 4, 5 year cycle, and then they're looking for the next shiny penny. Yeah. They get like, oh, I'm so excited about but then the question always comes up, and I hate this question. What's next? What's new?
Yeah, totally.
And I'm like, man, the work that a lot of these organizations are doing is there's not a next. It's like we're doing the same thing, and it might be boring in a sense, but it needs to be done. And it's like, if I have to kind of invent something new and sexy and next every 3 years just to keep you interested, so you're not going on to the next shiny new penny doing the next thing, that's a nightmare for a nonprofit. You know what I mean?
That's so good. Well, and you've seen, I think one of the things I've appreciated and learned a lot in just obviously knowing you and sort of watching what you do, also finding sort of the economically sustainable, like understanding that it's not only philanthropic dollars as well. I think on our issue of human trafficking and sort of the vulnerabilities there, like somebody coming out of exploitation needs a future. Like they need, it requires job creation. And so I think I still feel like we're in the infancy from a philanthropic sector of understanding the convergence of sort of traditional philanthropy, but then also sort of economically self-perpetuating.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so much of
well, like, I mean, systems theory and like Danelle Meadows, she's kind of one of the people that people turn to. So she has this kind of bathtub analogy, which is pretty simple. But you think about the work that people do, it's, you've got this bathtub that's just filling up with water, and you've got all these people that are taking their cups and kind of bailing the tub out to kind of keep the level down. That's a lot of that work. But then how do we actually then turn off the spigot? And so you and I have talked before, like turning off the spigot is like, how do we actually affect markets and economies to where the people aren't finding themselves in a situation where they have no other choice but to sell their daughter, at least in their mind. They have no other choice for their family. Got too many kids, and they'd be like, I can't care for this child. And so that's what happens. So on some, there's an economic, there's a geopolitical issue that is creating these circumstances in which we find many of these people. And so how do we actually work at kind of that systems level, the both ends of the spectrum? How do we enact, from your perspective, how do we enact better laws? How do we support people that find themselves in the system? And then actually, how do we help shut off some of these spigots by providing better opportunities, for those that are coming out, but also so that people don't have to go in, turn off that spigot. So
yeah, absolutely.
How do you balance, and I'm curious, because this comes up a lot too, you work in a global context, like that balance of you're in Seattle, U.S. is not perfect by any means. There's a lot of people in the United States that face slavery and trafficking, people that are brought in, people locally. How do you balance kind of that global reach, global focus when there is such a massive local kind of national challenge? How do you balance that? How do you think about that? Because some people might look at you and say, hey, U.S. has enough problems, like let's just get down and dirty and focus on solve these issues. How do you balance that, and how do you think about that kind of complex global conversation?
Yeah, it's definitely been a tension to navigate and to manage, to realize, we have obviously a huge issue here in the United States. The bulk of the people in exploitation globally are international. And so there's this element of like the majority of those who are in exploitation from a total numbers are international. And yet it's a huge issue here in the US. And we also here in the US have some of the highest consolidation of organizations. So like the number of organizations sort of per victim in exploitation would be one of the highest in the world here. And yet we do a lot here, one, because oftentimes the resources are generated here, not just financial resources, but in terms of, we were one of the first countries in the world to start having actually like academic programs studying trauma on the trauma and victims of human trafficking and what kind of trauma models can be helpful. And so we realized pretty quickly we needed to integrate U.S. organizations. So about half of our network is actually here in the United States. They've sort of seen it as, hey, part of our job, because we have access maybe to more financial resources, but also training, is to sort of pioneer some of the models that we can give away to others and invite others to like, hey, this is what we've tried, and we had this access, and we've tried this curriculum or this training. And so we've tried to create this ecosystem where it is a global community learning and growing together. But the other element that we see is how interconnected trafficking is. So during COVID, for instance, when people were locked down, not traveling as much, obviously things like sex tourism was down because people couldn't go to a lot of the places they might otherwise go. And so there was a huge spike in online exploitation. People like live streaming. And there was a study done out of the Philippines that the number was roughly like 1 out of every 67 kids, which is a staggering number, was being exploited for live stream exploitation. Wow. So, and usually within the confines of their own home. And so in that instance, you'd have a lot of Americans participating in a way without ever leaving the United States. They're on demand, like, sending what kind of exploitation they want to see that's being live streamed with children being exploited around the world. Wow. And so this issue is a distinctly international, interconnected issue. Mm-hmm. And you can't just fight it in one pocket without seeing this global ecosystem where the demand in one place is going to create, the exploitation in another place.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
I mean, yeah, so really I was just down in Tijuana, which has one of the largest red light districts in North America. And in the red light area there, the limos that like wait at the border and they pick up Americans that can just walk right across the border and go straight in to this red light district. And so again, it's the exploitation in one context is interconnected with the demand in another context. And so you have to take that international interconnected approach.
Wow. Well, let's turn to so organizations that you have in the Atlas Free Network, how do they come in? Like, what does that look like? I would imagine you have some criteria and you need to kind of think through, okay, who has a level of skill and expertise and traction in a sense? Like, how do you work with those frontline organizations? And then how do you measure and grow towards what is success? You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there's a goal that we're improving these organizations and the work they're doing.
And we actually made some sort of recent, pretty significant expansion to how we think about it. So initially, the seasons of the organizations, when we launched, I mentioned we were primarily focused internationally on, hey, how do we find organizations that people in the US don't even have access to? They don't have a nonprofit, they don't have a presence here, they're isolated and alone in their countries. And so we saw it as this is primarily an international solution to finding these organizations, connecting them together. And then we started getting more and more requests from within the US of people that were like, we need to be a part of this community. Like, we want to participate. And some of what I answered earlier, seeing this interconnectedness, seeing this desire to share resources. So then we included the US, but for the first number of years, it was a very outbound. We would find an organization, we would come alongside of them, and then all of the network members were getting a significant infusion of capital.
Yeah.
And so that the challenge with that meant if every member had to be funded, we couldn't add more members until we had more funding to sustain not just a one-time infusion, but like a monthly or sort of quarterly allocation. And so what ended up happening, we had this growing backlog of organizations like, please, can we participate? Like, can we waive the right to funding and just like have access to the community and the resources?
Wow.
And so we started to think about it differently as we had more, the desire for the network was growing faster than our baseline budget. And so we ended up making the decision of like, okay, let's open it up and sort of create the space where obviously if we're infusing capital into an organization, that's a higher level of sort of vetting and evaluation. And then we have sort of a different baseline to say, hey, to participate in this community, there's baseline criteria of how you have to be structured, what your mission is, what your focus is, a baseline level of sort of credibility and validation to participate. But we opened it up in the last couple of years for sort of broader participation with the hope of sort of the rising tide lifts all the ships. And so those organizations that maybe wouldn't have qualified in the previous model where we're coming in with a huge infusion of capital, they can access the training, the learnings, the community. You can see that improvement. And then as they grow, that it opens up sort of new opportunities for funding. We have a organizational coaching component where organizations are actually requesting like a year of sort of executive coaching and, working on launching sort of some other cohort model, accelerating programs so that we can have more organizations. So we actually just announced last week that we doubled the number of organizations in the network.
Wow.
Last year. So
that's phenomenal.
So some exciting changes to make it possible for more organizations to benefit from the community.
Dude, that's great. Well, I'm a fan. I think what you're doing is awesome. And I know it's not easy. I know you travel a lot. There's things that keep you up at night. If we can close kind of this last question, like what are some things, if you had a skunk works, like what are some major gaps or like, what are you jazzed to kind of, man, if we could go do this for people that are being trafficked and enslaved around the world, it would be amazing. Like, I'm sure there's things where you're like, man, if we could go do this, like, is there something that you guys are dreaming about as you think about the next 5-10 years of Atlas Free?
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that we're really excited about moving towards, and I think kind of to some of our earlier conversation about philanthropy, starting to think more systemic, is this network model really enables us to pursue a future where every component of the fight is aligned in every region of the world. Like right now, you could have somebody that's getting out of trafficking in one country, but there's zero recourse to justice, right? Like in a lot of places, the traffickers more likely to be struck by lightning than they are to be prosecuted. So they're just going to fill that vacancy in the brothel like right away. But then in another country, you could have somebody that's amazing at training law enforcement and prosecuting traffickers, but if there might not be a thriving safe house, and if that woman doesn't have that place to go and thrive, she's not going to be able to testify. And so it's true. That idea of sort of co-locating those programs and services in every region of the world. And a huge part of that right now is global prosecutions are decreasing. Number of victims is rising. Prosecutions are actually going the wrong way. And in a lot of places, we see a lot of the survivors don't know what their legal options are, even if they have really viable legal options, because that's it. One, it's an expensive part of it. Typically, the legal, it's long-term, it's messy, it's risky. And so they want to make sure
it's vulnerable. You know what I mean? Like these are humans that, they now have to talk about things that they probably don't want to talk about, so it's all those things.
Yeah, exactly. But from a systems standpoint is like rule of law, like what we're seeing now is we're at the tip of the spear of civil liability, like even banking systems getting sued. And like, so the possibility, for me, one of the things that gets me excited is like, well, let's get more of the bad guys behind bars. But what if these survivors start testifying and start finding that, there's been hotel chains that have been sued and had to settle.
Wow.
There's been banks that have had to settle for knowingly fostering an environment or, creating that space. And so once that starts happening, once the banks and the hotels and sort of society starts realizing like, hey, if we turn a blind eye to this, we could be held liable, or if platforms are knowingly facilitating it online. And suddenly survivors feel like, man, if I get out, I'll have the help I need, I'll have the resources, and I can hold people accountable. Like that's when we start to see bigger dominoes start to fall.
Jeremy's story is a compelling example of how personal conviction, professional experience, and strategic vision can converge to drive meaningful change on a global scale. From his early exposure to radical hospitality to his work across sectors, including business, tech, and nonprofit leadership, Jeremy has helped shape a networked approach to combating human trafficking that centers on collaboration, local leadership, and systemic impact. If today's episode resonated with you, we encourage you to learn more about Atlas Free at atlasfree.org and consider how you might support or engage with this important work. Today's episode of More Than Profit was hosted by me, Bryce Butler. Our executive producer is Crystal Esquivel, and our associate producers are Bryn McKay and Bailey Pendleton. Graphics design is by Justin Esquivel, and audio production assistance is provided by Resonate Recording. Today's theme music is Bonfire by As Tall as Pine and Better Start Now by Kit Benny.
Thanks for tuning in to More Than Profit, a podcast produced by Access Ventures. We hope today's conversation inspired you to think differently about how values, vision, and capital can create meaningful change. To stay up to date, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, we'd love if you left a review to help others find the show. Visit us at www.accessventures.org/podcast for additional content and past episodes. You can also join the conversation by following us on Twitter at ACS Ventures. I'm Bryn McKay, and you've been listening to More Than Profit, a production of Access Ventures. See you next time.